All right, welcome to Tribe Talk. Purpose is the tribe is a group of like-minded people who have more in common than they have differences. We're here to have a dialogue with coaches, enhance communication, and develop our improvement culture. This is an independent event, not sponsored by any organization, regardless of who participates. Our one simple motive is improvement. You have to forgive me. I've been on vacation. Normal faces in here tonight. If you have any problems, let me know, and we'll work through them and get on with whatever we have to get on with. Tonight, we have Chris Perry from Missouri, and he will be giving us a presentation on best students in the BRC. And then we'll have a try talk, weekly poll, and whatever comes up.
All right, Don, your audio was cutting out, but I think you said you're ready for me. Is that right?
Yes, Chris. Just got rid of the share, so jump in as you will.
All right, sounds good. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. Give me just a quick second as I pull up my presentation. All right, can everybody see that all right? All right, Don had to give me a crash course in this, so we'll hope that I don't fumble through it too bad. Anyway, welcome tonight. As you may already know, my name is Chris Perry. I'm talking about using a sign language interpreter in the BRC. I want to talk about a couple little housekeeping things. First of all, number one, at the end of this presentation, if you'd like a summarized PDF of it, send me an email. My contact information will come up at the end of the slides. You can screenshot that or scribble it down real quick if anybody's interested. Second thing, it says for the BRC, but as you may already know, that can be interchangeable, BRC2, ARC, NRC, three-wheel, whatever. These are general concepts if you have deaf and hard of hearing folks in your classes and need to use an interpreter. Also, this presentation is assuming that you're at the point that you have agreed to use a sign language interpreter. So this is all about what do you do to use an interpreter? How does that process look like? How does it work? And also I want to let you know, there'll be a few things that will be interactive. Not much, but I'm going to ask you guys some questions throughout the presentation, and I'd appreciate it if you jump in and give some questions or answers or experiences, share your knowledge. So any questions or concerns so far? If you can hear me okay, give me a thumbs up. I'm using these newfangled earpiece devices, so just making sure I can be heard. All right, let's jump into it. The first thing about this presentation, we're going to try to answer three questions. The first of which being, am I even required to use an interpreter? The second of which being, if I am, how do I go about doing it? And the third, is it going to cost me my shirt? So let's jump right into that. First of all, with using an interpreter, let's get a little background out of the way first. Deaf and hard of hearing. What exactly does it mean to be deaf? We're going to answer that question. We're also going to answer the question of how many people are deaf and hard of hearing in our locales and in the country. And finally, we're going to talk about, are there even deaf motorcyclists? So first and foremost, an interpreter. Do I have to use one? Well, there's a lot of confusion about exactly what interpreters are all about. Here's a kind of little funny look at it I thought we'd start with. Not everybody's an interpreter that knows sign language. Every interpreter knows sign language, but not everybody who knows sign language is an interpreter. So we want to make sure we get the right people in front of our students. Per the ADA, or Americans with Disability Act, and I'll read it verbatim, a qualified interpreter is one who's able to interpret effectively, accurately, and impartially, both receptively and expressively, using necessary specialized vocabulary. That doesn't include everyone. So we want to make sure that we have exactly the right kind of people doing it for us. There's different types of sign language. There's American Sign Language. There's manually coded English. There's signing exact English, pigeon sign English. There's a whole bunch of different ones. So if you have somebody who simply knows how to sign, but they're not a qualified interpreter, they may not know the difference, may not be able to accommodate your deaf or hard of hearing student. There's also credentialing that goes on with interpreters. Just like us, we have to maintain our credentials to be rider coaches. Interpreters have to do the same. They have continuing education credits to make sure that they're up to snuff on all the things they need to do annually in order to be able to serve proficiently. So how do we know when we've got a good interpreter or not? Let me back up. I want to talk about one thing real quick. I missed this. With our definition of deaf, I want to talk about a couple things. First of all, we have what we call pathologically deaf. That's more of a medical perspective. It's how health professionals look at deaf people. They're impaired. They're unable to hear. However, core deaf people don't look at themselves in that way. They look at themselves as culturally deaf, meaning they subscribe to a system of mores and values and different things that all are all embodied by their language. So they don't look at themselves as disabled or impaired in any way. So in fact, many of us call them hearing impaired. They actually consider that an insult. They prefer to be called deaf and or hard of hearing because that has a cultural perspective to it and it's more appealing to them. There are approximately 466 million people in the world with some kind of hearing loss or deficit. That's by the WHO, the World Health Organization, whom we've all heard a lot from in the last 3 months. In the United States alone, there's about 600,000 folks. About 3.6, a little less than 4% of those folks are deaf, culturally and pathologically. And so we have a lot of folks in our country who may want to learn to ride. And it kind of behooves us to have at least a game plan when we want to teach those folks. So we need to talk about what is not an interpreter as well. The people who have a great aunt who took a sign language class in 3rd grade at Sunday school, and knows a few finger spelled words, that's not an interpreter. And because she can communicate a little bit, may not be the correct person to put in front of our deaf students in a class. Sometimes we get teachers of deaf who work at deaf schools and the like. They're obviously fluent. They may not be certified interpreters. They're okay to put, they have a fluency with the language, as well as children of deaf adults. They grew up with that being their first language, even though they're hearing like us, or siblings of deaf adults. Same thing. We want to make sure we've got people who are familiar with the different sign languages and have credentials, have proper credentials. Also, we talked about the different languages, but understand that just because somebody has a knowledge of the language doesn't mean they're a good fit for interpreting. That particular person may have nuances that the deaf person doesn't understand. Don't have to know a whole lot about the linguistic part of it, but just understand not everybody that signs can or should be an interpreter for our classes. So we talk about language barriers. Let me tell you this. This is going to be one of our interactive things. So I'm going to ask you for your feedback on this after I give you this story. But I want you to kind of envision this, okay? It's been your lifelong ambition to go learn how to be an underwater basket weaver. And so you found a class that's in Mexico, all right? So you've agreed to fly there. You're going to take this class. But this class is going to be given to you in Spanish. You don't know Spanish, but you've agreed to go because you know a little Spanish. You took a middle school or high school class once, and so you feel fairly familiar with some of the verbiage. So you've agreed to do it without an interpreter because the company won't pay for it. It's on your bucket list. Your best friend who's fluent in Spanish couldn't accompany you on the trip, so you're going to fly it solo. So you get there, we're in the classroom portion of this, and everything's being spoken in Spanish. There's little idiosyncrasies, there's jokes being told and different things, and you can't comprehend those words, but you laugh kind of half-heartedly, a little nervously because you want to fit in. But you get through the classroom portion, you even take a test, and you're okay. So now you get all geared up in your scuba gear. You've never scuba dived before, but you're now in all of your gear and going out to the water. So your instructor, again, still speaking in Spanish, gives you instruction each time before you go down and take a dive. This instruction you're not really understanding. However, you nod your head affirmatively and do the best you can because you passed the test after all. But the things that are concerns are, obviously you've never been scuba diving before. There are some life and death consequences potentially. The direct communication is only going to happen prior to the exercise, and after that it's going to be indirect in the form of body language, signs, things like that, gesturing, and things like that underwater. And so before each time you go submerged, you get that instruction, and then you're kind of on your own. So what I want to hear from you guys is, what are some possible potential problems with that scenario of you learning underwater basket weaving in Mexico without an interpreter?
Well, you may misinterpret anything that's safety related.
Absolutely. 100%.
Drowning.
What else?
Drowning.
Drowning's an ever-present possibility. So we want to, and if you didn't get the information that may keep you from drowning, it may be a problem.
That's right.
As you put it, there's some specific things to scuba and maybe basket weaving that aren't covered in your high school generic Spanish.
100%. Yeah. And that's mostly, unless there's anybody else, that's mostly what I want to touch upon. You may have a little bit of peripheral knowledge of the language and the culture, and you may be able to squeak your way through with, where's the bathroom? Can I have another margarita? Things that may get you by normally. But now we're in a life or death situation that could end very badly for you if you don't have all the information you need. Now, obviously, you understand that that's underwater basket weaving is just a lame euphemism for what we do with BRCs, but it's an opportunity for us to see how critical it can be if information that can save somebody's life is not readily available to them in the language that they understand. All right, the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading it all, but it's basically like the Civil Rights Act of '64, with the exception of, at the very end of that phrase, I want you to see, and imposes accessibility requirements on public accommodations. How that affects us, we're going to talk about here shortly. In the case of accessibility, what we may need to do is, for people in wheelchairs, not necessarily for our motorcycle classes, but just in general with the ADA, for people in wheelchairs, we build ramps. For folks who are blind, we have Braille. For folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, we may have to institute an interpreter, okay? That's one of the many accommodations called for under the ADA. And there are some exceptions to that rule, but the vast majority of businesses who encounter a deaf or hard of hearing person do need to accommodate them in one of those ways, which could include an interpreter, okay? Now let's talk about some general rules about how to use an interpreter. We'll also talk about adapting to the BRC. So I want you to think about that, because that again will be interactive. I'll ask you some questions about how we adapt using an interpreter to the specifics of the BRC, as well as finding and hiring interpreters. How do we go about that process? So number one, with the general rules, let's talk about a few of them. The very first thing, if you've agreed to have an interpreter and all the paperwork's taken care of on that side, first thing you need to do is talk to your interpreter prior to the event. Make sure that he or she is on the same page with you and that they understand what your presentation is going to be about, any key words or concepts, things that will help them interpret for you, because otherwise you're just going to seem incompetent because they can't get the information to your customer, which is your student. Number two, speak directly to your deaf individual. If you've got Joe deaf and you've got Sally interpreter, don't say to Sally, hey, tell Joe blah, blah, blah. Speak directly to Joe. Joe's going to look away from time to time because he needs to see the message from Sally, but keep that communication direct between you and Joe. Understand that the code of ethics of interpreters requires them to interpret everything. So don't tell Sally, hey, you don't have to interpret this, but hey, that he was having a little trouble there on exercise number 4, right? She's going to interpret that. That's what she's required to do. So know that everything's on the table. Number 4, interpreters most often are going to require two of them for the things that we do for our BRC, our basic writer courses. And that's kind of non-negotiable. It's an industry standard. It's very taxing as an interpreter. Physically, yes, but more so mentally. And those breaks are built into having both interpreters. Number 5, make sure that you're speaking normally. Don't speed up, don't slow down, just speak normally and clearly. Make sure that all your words can be understood. Number 6, if you've got any notes or anything you can give ahead of time, make sure you give those to your deaf student. We obviously have the benefit of having our writer handbook, but there's anything that you can think of that might help that student, because English is not their first language. Sign language is. It has its own phonology and its own syntax and grammar and everything. So also make sure you give any presentations, number 7, to your interpreter, because again, they're standing in for you. And it begs to mention number 8, again, make sure that you understand everything that goes on in the class, and everything that you say is going to be interpreted. So if somebody lets one rip in the middle of class and people are laughing, your interpreter is going to say, hey, that guy farted. So understand that that dynamic is there. All right. My modest attempts at a little humor. Adapting to the BRC. Okay, so this is what I want to talk about and be a little interactive. Where, and specifically for those of you who have used interpreters before, had deaf students in your class, if you have, where might we need to use interpreters, and how would we use them in our BRC course?
Well, I've used interpreters both in the classroom and on the range. I happen to find a really good one that we used multiple times now, but initially coming in, this is probably 1 or 2 curricula ago, I kind of gave them a heads up on what we do and how we do it, how the structure of the classroom worked and how the range worked, and gave her materials in advance. I gave her the range cards and kind of explained and said, for example, when the demo is happening, I really need them to be watching the demo. We can catch up. I'll tell them what's going to happen in advance. They're going to watch the demo. And if you want to, translate afterwards what was happening in the demo, you can, kind of bring that out. But while the demo is happening, they need to be watching the demo and not you. And it worked out very well. I mean, this person actually enjoyed the process. She's thinking about signing up for class.
That's awesome. Thank you, Lynn. She just gave us a clinic on how to handle that appropriately. That's excellent. Well done. And it benefits you as the instructor to have that communication with your interpreter, because they're trying to get that message out to our students. Obviously, there's some safety issues if they don't get that information. Anyone else want to add anything to how we would adapt having an interpreter in the BRC? Maybe someone who hasn't used an interpreter before?
Well, I have used an interpreter before, and I learned that there is not an international sign language for our clutch and our brake. So we discussed it, and I had 3 deaf students in one class. It was a father, daughter, and a friend of the family. So they all knew each other very well. They brought their own interpreter. And so we discussed it a little bit and decided what we should use for clutch and brake, and that we made that work for them, and that also helped the interpreter out because she had no motorcycle knowledge prior to the class. Unfortunately, she was a last-minute fill-in too.
Yeah, Carol, thanks for that. And yeah, you and I have spoken about that briefly before. And I appreciate the experience that some of you folks have had with using sign language interpreters, whether formal or informal. And we got to make do with what we have. And so we're blessed when someone brings their own interpreter. The only problems that I'd caution on, and you know this, is that we have to make sure that that person is sufficient enough to get the message conveyed in a way that, will keep the student safe and pardon the term, will keep our butts out of hot water if anything were to go awry. So, yeah, thank you for that. Anybody else want to add anything on how we may adapt to the BRC with interpreters?
Well, I just throw out too that if you're using a quote amateur interpreter, a friend of the family or something, there is a difference, as you brought out, between speaking a language and interpreting, because to be able to have the information going in and to be spitting it out at the same time that more information is going in that you need to translate is a definite skill. And it is mentally exhausting, to do it for a long period of time. I totally get it.
Lynn, I'll
Thank
add.
you for that.
I was going to add to that. I was surprised when we needed several interpreters, but I could see after a short period of time how exhausting it could be for the interpreter. And we were fortunate to have 2 interpreters who had done this before several times and had enjoyed it and sort of had a sense of the curriculum. It made it a lot easier for everybody. So if you can identify, a core group, if you're so lucky, that really does help.
Yeah, absolutely. We take it for granted because we do the classes over and over again. We have familiarity. We know what's coming up next. We've got the range cards. But oftentimes the interpreters are new to the situation. They may not be motorcyclists themselves. And, it's taxing on them physically and mentally, both. So yeah, thank you for that, Betsy.
The first interpreter that I worked with actually was a former student. It was somebody who came back after class and said, "Hey, could we do this?"
Excellent.
And why not? And one of the things that evolved during that class was I learned to stop sort of doing 2 classes at the same time and realized that if the deaf students were getting it, and understanding and being able to participate fully, that we could run the whole class as somewhat as if everybody in the class was deaf and not doing things twice and splitting things up. But when they were supposed to be focused on the demonstration, there was no talking. And, eliminating verbal coaching unless, because this was a number of years ago, but eliminating verbal coaching unless the students were stopped by the coach. I thought, if it works for a part of the class, it will work for everybody. And actually, the interpreter said it greatly reduced the amount of stress that she was under because she wasn't having to watch other things that were going on, because we evolved to, mostly on the second day, when I started figuring things out, that we were able to just do 1 class and that she was only interpreting the speech part, and made it a lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for adding that, Mark. You talked about some really good points there, one of which being, the interpreter is a paid person if they're a professional interpreter that we've brought in. So we tend to not think of them, but again, they have a tough job to do, especially if they're unfamiliar with our curriculum. And at the end of the day, it's all about our student, and they're unable to get that information to the student if we're not making it a little more. I'm not saying change up the way you teach, but I like your example there, Mark, of saying, instead of teaching 2 classes, we're teaching 1. Instead of diverting our attention in dual ways, we're giving all that attention in a way that seemed to be a little bit more applicable. So that's great. Thank you for that. Anything else? Okay.
Hi, Chris. It's Dave.
Hey, Dave.
Nice to see you. We here in Nebraska, in the Omaha area, we actually group deaf students in a class a year at our National Safety Council training site. And we use 2 to reduce the fatigue factor. And like Mark said, once a coach figures out when to speak and when maybe to wait, it actually works quite well. We do not have mixed classes. We ask deaf students to wait and sign up for a certain class. and it's worked out fairly well for most of the students. And of course, it helps a rider coach develop their signaling skills as opposed to flapping their gums a lot when a student stops next to them.
Yeah, excellent points. It tends to get us, those of us that maybe like to hear ourselves talk, we tend to adjust and change a little bit and talk less with our deaf students. It kind of makes us kind of like we know our students come in and take our BRCs and makes them better car drivers. Well, oftentimes we teach our deaf students, it makes us better instructors overall. So, and Dave, I also like how you guys try to get all the deaf students together. We're going to talk about that a little later on in the presentation, those kinds of options. And that's great if you've got that buy-in from the state level and other folks, maybe other sites who are willing and able to do those things. Sometimes you'll get the stalwart deaf student who will say, hey, that date doesn't work for me, and I want this date, I want it at that site, this is where I'm going. But for the most part, they understand we're trying to accommodate them. They can meet us halfway. So those negotiations, those talks are really good. So thanks for adding that.
You're welcome, Chris. Just one more comment, since you mentioned
Absolutely.
it. We're asked and tasked by federal law to make a reasonable accommodation, and I have in fact had an occasional deaf student who I would argue wasn't being totally reasonable.
Right, absolutely. And that's a really good point, Dave. For the ADA is a little ambiguous on some of its words, not on the accommodation part, but on the reasonable. What's a reasonable accommodation? And like I said at the start, that may involve sign language interpreters. More often than not, it does. But yeah, we try to meet them halfway if we can. So, in talking about finding and hiring interpreters, one of the things you see on the screen now, I've got KCDHH, which is that stands for the Kansas Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I was born and raised in Missouri, but when I became a sign language interpreter and when I became a rider coach, I was residing in Kansas, so I've got that there on my slide. But that represents a state agency that almost all the states in the union have that oversee deaf and hard of hearing issues. Okay, so the Kansas Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Missouri, another state that I work in and have a home in, Missouri Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Almost all states have some governing body like that deals with affairs with the deaf and hard of hearing. That's on the state level. So if you're looking for interpreters, that's a great resource to utilize. As well as on the national level, we have the RID, which stands for the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, as well as NAD, the National Association of the Deaf. You don't have to remember those places, but just know that there are resources out there to help you find and hire appropriate professional interpreters. The reason I stress that, as most of you would already have guessed, it's the difference between us formally teaching a BRC that someone has to pay money for, as opposed to, well, I got a cousin whose uncle, he's been riding for 50 years and he offered to teach me for free, so I'm just going to take it from him. Well, we know that's fraught with many issues that we would address appropriately. And it's the same with having an interpreter. It's great if they can bring somebody, but we may have to pay a little bit of money in order to make sure that everything, all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. All right, then we get to, after we've found and hired interpreters, how's this pay thing working? Who's responsible for it? First of all, the hourly rate for interpreters. Let's not, pull punches here. Interpreters are expensive, depending upon several factors. The agency who you're working through, or maybe the freelance individual themselves, the interpreter's specific skill and certification, the area of the country that you're working with, all those things factor in. It can be anywhere between $30 to $50 and up per hour. So understand they get pricey real quick. And again, we talked before about how many interpreters. We'll talk about that shortly. But that hourly rate is 30 to 50 or up, depending on several factors. Mileage, those again depend on those several factors. But the current IRS mileage for 2020 is 57.5 cents a mile. So do the math. If someone's making a 20-mile commute one way, they're going to charge you 40 miles for that one day. It can get pricey, and that's part of our industry standard, as well as what's the minimum commitment. We're not going to get an interpreter out for 1 hour, 2 hours. They're going to have a 2-hour minimum. So even if you have them show up just to do some remedial teaching with someone who took your class last weekend, it's probably going to be a 2-hour commitment on that particular time. They showed up for 30 minutes. So understand that going in. As well as almost always you're going to have 2 interpreters for what we do. We've talked about how taxing it is physically as well as mentally. It's also can be taxing on the deaf person, having to watch an interpreter for their communication. It gives visual eye strain quite often. So BRC specific costs. Let's talk about what it may cost for us. And we'll just do some quick math in the air. What it may cost for us as coaches or site administrators to bring someone in for a BRC. We'll just go lowball at $30 an hour for one interpreter. We're doing let's just say 20-hour class, which is a requirement in the state of Kansas. We're doing a 20-hour class. Right there, you've already got $600. That's not counting mileage, which will probably be around $100. So there's $700. We've got to have 2 interpreters. That's $1,400 so far, and those are just the most generic numbers for one student in one class. So as you can see, these prices or these expenses can add up very, very quickly. So what I want to talk about is how can we possibly reduce those costs? What things can we do to maybe pay less? Not skimping on the service, because we want to provide good service. We want to make sure that the student is safe. But what other things can we do? Well, one possibility is, when we can, hiring one sign language interpreter. That's not always an option, but it's something to discuss. If there's, again, maybe you've got the classroom, or excuse me, the range portion, which we would normally say an agency would tell you, we need 2 interpreters for that because it's going to be 5 hours out on the range, right? Or maybe more with pre and post work. Well, as we know, that interpreter is not going to be working that whole time. There are breaks in there. There's breaks given in between where the students are writing and not watching, but we're not communicating, right? So maybe that's a place where we can only have one interpreter. Those just an option. Another option is maybe having an all-deaf BRC, which of course Dave Halen had alluded to. That's a great idea, great option if you can get all parties involved and on the same page with it. Maybe if you've got a schedule that's already set for just regular students who are hearing, but then you've got a component of deaf folks, or maybe one deaf person who shows up and says, "Hey, I want to take the course. Hey, do you have any friends? Maybe we can get a class schedule that's not on our current schedule, our current calendar, and maybe that offsets the expense that sign language interpreters bring to the table." Perhaps you have writer coaches who are fluent in sign, who know how to sign, and can teach specifically to a deaf BRC. So everyone in the class signs, whether they're deaf, hard of hearing, or hearing, everyone signs. There's not a whole lot of us that can do that in the country, but there are a few. Have bike, will travel, so keep that in mind if the need arises. However, that eliminates the expense of an interpreter. We all know what we get paid normally as writer coaches. That's a heck of a lot less than what interpreters cost. So keep that as an option. And Red Sword forums and things, maybe we can communicate and figure out where people are in the country. And then finally, and this is not as much of an option because there's very few people that can do this, but there are some writer coach trainers in the country who are fluent in sign language. And I know of at least one time that there has been a RCP, a coach prep in sign language for some deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So again, these are some options. I'm not saying they are the options. They're tools for your toolbox. You use whatever works for you. Now we all remember, hopefully you remember, these particular individuals. They were in the news because they didn't know what the heck they were doing. They weren't interpreters. They were making a mockery of it. And as funny as it might seem to us with the stuff they were doing, especially with the guy down in the bottom right, this was a briefing on Irma. This is absolutely critical to people's health and safety. And if we don't put the right type of individuals in front of the people to get them the information they know, that can be very catastrophic for life. Obviously, we've all seen enough of this over the last 3 months. Every time you turn on the news, there's an interpreter interpreting some government official's message, and rightfully so that all of our citizens can get that information. All right, so the very last thing I want to talk about with this presentation is litigation and lawsuits. Now, I've got, 6 of them that I want to talk about, but we'll just narrow it down to one. And what I mean by this is, what happens if we don't provide interpreters? What happens if, God forbid, somebody goes down on the range and hurts themselves and wants to bring it back to us in the form of litigation? We all know the incident reports and how imperative it is that we fill those out correctly and things like that. But what's your defense when you say, well, they brought their own interpreter? And I'm not trying to nail anybody on that, because I've done that too, but it's also been brought to my attention. Any lawyer fresh off the bar is going to be, hey, that can't happen. That person's not qualified. Why did, that information wasn't thoroughly presented to my client, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not a lawyer. I only play one on TV. So, but we could see where that could get very hairy very quickly. Case in point, United Parcel Service, UPS, many years ago suffered a class action lawsuit that they had to succumb to. They actually lost the lawsuit. Unfortunately, a deaf employee lost his or her life because UPS refused to supply interpreters. And as a result, this person was killed in a dock accident where one of the trucks backed up to the dock, and you could see how that went sour very quickly. And the first thing that was understood was they refused to provide interpreters. Now, granted, most of our sites don't have the money UPS does, but the concept is still there. And so we have to take it very seriously to make sure that we're giving proper accommodations. So any questions or concerns about that? All right. Thanks for listening. I do have a video for you guys, but real quick, there's my contact information. If you want to screenshot that and send me an email, email is the best way to contact me. I'll send you a PDF summary of the presentation. I'm always available as a resource for if you have deaf or hard of hearing students or anything of that nature. Please feel free to reach out to me. And I would like to go ahead and start a video for you. The video is 8.5 minutes long, so grab you some popcorn. It's of a cohort of mine that some of you may know. Her name is Jasmine Blue Creek Clark, and she's out of Colorado. Maybe some of you know her, have met with her. She's a great gal. I heard somebody, it might have been Lynn, had referred back to the old RSS days. I wasn't around back then, but Jasmine was. So she's a coach that's been around a long time and seen a lot of things. But anyway, she has put together a presentation, a video of her years, over the years working with deaf students. Now, she's not an interpreter, and she'll be the first one to tell you that, her signing skills aren't the best, but they're adequate, and she tries real hard and she communicates effectively. But she's a writer coach who was trained all deaf classes and has made a lot of lasting friendships in that regard. And she put together a little conglomeration of some of her experiences, and I told her it was just too cool to pass up. So I'd like to share that with you guys, if that's all right. Let me get out of there. I'll pull it up real quick. Thank you for your patience. Okay. I'm not sure I did that right. Hold on. All right. Give me a second, folks.
No worries. Take your time.
All right, Don, it's not working like I wanted to, but let's see what I can do here.
Go back to share screen.
Yeah.
Bring up the particular one. Is it still there? From
No,
the
it's
video?
not showing me anywhere.
Okay.
It's not giving me an option for the video.
Okay. try to find a way to bring your video back up.
Okay, video's
Hi,
up now.
Okay. Then Alt Tab to zoom,
Alt tab.
share screen.
Yep. And share screen. But when I bring that up, there's no video.
It may show as blank if it's not playing yet. Do you see a window that could be it?
Yeah. Okay, let me try that. No, that wasn't it. Now, you guys see a Zoom screen up?
Yep.
Hmm.
Do you
Try it
have it
again.
on a website or?
No, I don't. Let me try something real quick. I apologize, folks. Be patient
That's
with me.
all right. It's cool.
Technologically non-savvy here.
You can just watch the video and sign it for us.
Yeah, right? Well, I'm expensive, though.
Yeah, I'm sure Don will cover it for us.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Okay.
Can you play and stop the video without sharing first?
Nah, nothing's going, Don. I don't know what the deal is. We may not get to watch that film. I apologize, guys. All right. Well, back to the drawing board. Any questions or concerns with what we've talked about today? Any anecdotal information? We've heard from Carol. We've heard from Lynn. They've had experience. Anyone else had any experience teaching deaf and hard of hearing? I see John Scala on the line. My buddies in St. Louis. Maybe John has some information for us.
I have a question about, well, I guess maybe the procedures and politics of this. Is the deaf person allowed to insist on a particular interpreter?
If you get a deaf or hard of hearing person in your class, what's the first thing, like someone who signs up, maybe they send you an email, what's the first thing you're going to do?
Well, I reach out to them and find out, you know, what their story is and what their needs are. But I did have an instance a while ago where a student was very insistent on they wanted this particular interpreter. And
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
yes,
Lynn, are you talking? I can't. I see your highlighted, but I can't hear you.
I am talking. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Lynn.
All right, we'll try that. I don't know how much of that you heard or didn't hear, so I'll backtrack a little bit. My question was whether or not the deaf person is allowed to insist on a particular interpreter. And I did have an instance a while ago where, you know, I reached out to the student who indicated that she was deaf and would need an interpreter. And they wanted to use this particular person who came at a much higher price than the person I normally use, who's got experience with the BRC and, you know, that we have confidence in. And we kind of went back and forth with a little bit about that. And I just wondered what the rules were regarding their preferences.
Can you hear me, Chris?
Looks like he's having technical problems, Don. Lynn,
Yeah.
my advice, and this is part of the reason we hold a class a year. It all lies in the words of the ADA law about this, and do you feel comfortable defending, you know, a reasonable accommodation? We have, to my knowledge, never conceded to an individual student that they're going to have a certain interpreter. We schedule the classes so they can't complain, hire a lawyer, et cetera, that you're not offering the class. I think it's unreasonable for a student to declare to you, I insist you use a certain interpreter. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but that's our stance here in the Omaha area.
Well, and I agree with that. And, you know, this was, you know, within a certain period, the sites were required to foot that bill on their own, and now they're covered by the state program. So it kind of puts a different light on the situation, which is a huge relief because, frankly, you know, if you have one deaf student in a class, by the time you've paid for the interpreter, you basically are writing off that class as a site administrator. So, you know, that was a huge relief of burden on the sites when, you know, that became the case here. So it certainly makes sense, if you can, to get multiple deaf people into one class and pay for the interpreter once rather than multiple times, just from a financial standpoint.
And that's exactly why we do that. And we consider, and the state DMV has backed us up, the sites here are not, they're private operations, they're private businesses. And the Safety Council, because they're a nonprofit, has basically taken on that if you want to call it a financial burden. The classes are actually pretty good. I enjoyed teaching them. It's easier on the voice.
I actually have one of my former students, I still keep up with him on Facebook, and his daughter, who was also in that class, she's actually moved on to a new field, and she's a dive scuba instructor down in the Keys. And I love seeing their adventures.
Okay, folks, I'm still trying to figure out this whole video thing. It's a cool video, and I really want you guys to see it, but apparently I'm not going to be able to get it done, so I apologize.
Chris, does it have an internet URL that you could share?
It may. I'm trying to send it to Don, actually, if he could pull it and then share it with the group, because of whatever I'm doing is ineffective.
Can you send it in the group chat, Chris? Just the link?
Yeah, I think well, it's such a large thing. It's only on Google Drive, and I'm not tech savvy enough to know how to get that over.
You want to Facebook it?
Yeah, possibly. Let me see if I can do that.
And then Don, if it's got a URL, then maybe you can push it out to those of us in RiderChoices.
One or the other.
I tell you what I'll do, if we're unable to get it here, I'll ask Don maybe to push it out at a later time, once we can figure out how I can get it to him. So again, I apologize, folks, but I appreciate you being here.
Don't worry about it, Chris. Having my own technical difficulties, I know how frustrating it is. Yeah. But you know, we've done this Zoom thing long enough. Everybody completely understands, I'm sure.
Oh, wait a minute. I think I got it, folks. Hold on.
All right. Here we go.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
I tell you what, I guess it took Don talking to me to keep it working. So anyway, thank you for your patience. Let's go ahead and start the video.
We have many special signs that we use in Colorado to teach our motorcycle safety classes to deaf. Please feel free to use our signs or make some up with your deaf students for your own classes. Let's talk about friction zone. Friction zone FZ, and then mimic using your friction zone. Gear shift. One finger, drop down, first gear. 2 up, 3 up. You let it reset each time, just like your gear shift ratchet. So we're in third gear, we want to go down to 2, we want to go down to 1. We want to go upshift, first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear. You got it. A S M I N E. For you male coaches, facial hair, beards, mustaches, goatees can make it really difficult for a deaf student to read your lips.
Rocky Mountain Deaf School, elementary school, the kids need a new building. What's your name? Oh, yeah. So they come out for the wow. And what's up today? Oh, really? Yeah. So now you got to buy another one? We're here today to help the Rocky Mountain Deaf School, elementary school, get a better building. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
All right. Any, what do you think about the video?
See quite a few thumbs up there.
Sweet. Well, thank you guys for listening. One thing I will add that I didn't talk about before, there are a lot of deaf riders in America, a lot. They, matter of fact, if Sturgis hadn't got canceled, there was going to be about 1,000 of them for this celebratory year converging on Sturgis. Going to go up there and meet them, but hopefully maybe next year. But anyway, lots of deaf folks out there want to learn to ride, and so you may have some deaf and hard of hearing folks coming to a BRC, NRC near you soon. So anyway, thanks again for coming today, folks.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Round of applause for Chris there. Anybody got any questions for Chris?
I do. She mentioned deaf etiquette, like tapping and whatever. Are there any other things that you can think of that might be helpful for us to know?
Yeah, absolutely, Betsy. Can you hear me okay? That's absolutely a good question. There are some things, there's a whole litany of things actually. One that comes to mind is like when you're in the classroom and we're on a break and deaf folks are talking. One of the ways we get their attention is by flipping the lights on and off. That's annoying to us who, are hearing because there's no purpose to it, but that's a standard way in the deaf community. So there are little nuances and things like that.
I have a suggestion. Take the time to learn their sign for their name. That shows them that you care and you really do want them to learn and be successful. And Chris, I dropped you a private message if you it's a yes or no.
I sure will. Thank you. And Carol, thanks for adding that, by the way. That's a very good personal touch there. Like any of our students, they want to feel a little bit of love from us, right? They want to know that they're special and that, that communication, that little bit of communication effort goes a long way. So yeah, thanks for adding that.
I just wanted to clarify on that most deaf people have a unique sign for their name. It's not just spelling their name. It's not just a generic Matt or Jim or whatever. It's unique to that particular person.
That's correct. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's cool. I did not know that.
I have a question for anyone who can answer. I've had mixed results with deaf students in my class. Most do well, but I have had some that don't do well, and maybe they're people who wouldn't do well even if they were hearing it. There's no way to measure that. But we know that riding a motorcycle as coaches, we have auditory clues to what the motorcycle is doing. And I know that when I've ridden electric motorcycles, I've been aware that, gee, this auditory clue is lacking, and it's a different experience for me. Does anybody have any tips on how, if you have struggles with a deaf person, ways that we can help them translate what they're feeling into, basically it's you do it and you get a response from the motorcycle, but the hearing part's not there, and that's a missing element. So are there ways that we can compensate for that?
I've got some thoughts on that, but I'd sure like to hear from Lynn or Carol from Carol about that. She's had some experience as well on that particular question.
They actually do feel the motorcycle. They feel the engine. They feel the RPMs. And it takes them a few times to get it, but let them figure it out. Just like any student, you got to let them figure it out. And they do figure it out fairly quickly.
Yeah, I would echo that. Thanks for saying that, Carol. One of the things that most of us have heard before, you lose one sense, the other senses become a little bit more keen. I don't know if that's actually true, but it seems to be in the case of deaf folks. They're very intuitive, and they feel the motorcycle, and it almost compensates for that lack of hearing. So, repetition, as we all know, gets it. And quite often they can figure out those same kind of problems without us instilling anything extra because of their hearing deficiency.
But with hearing students, they hear the sound of the engine, the sound of a skidding tire, whatever it is, but they don't necessarily know what that means. It takes them some experience to figure that out. And with deaf students, it seems to be exactly the same. It's just they're getting slightly different. They're working with different signals than the hearing students are, but it's the same process for them.
Well, I guess, when I have a deaf student where the engine, they've got the clutch squeezed in and the throttle is pegged, and if the clutch goes wrong, there's going to be some bad consequences from that. And, that's where my concerns have come up with my deaf students.
It's the same as when you have a hearing student that comes to a stop and has the throttle open and they don't know why, they don't know what the noise is. They know it's something, but you have to tell them, close the throttle. That sound is the throttle. And for a deaf student, it's that feeling is you holding the throttle open as if you were trying to go very fast.
Yeah, Jasmine in her video talked about one thing that kind of helps, making sure that you're out in front of the deaf students because, they don't have, of course, we shouldn't be hollering across the range at our hearing students either, but they don't have the benefit of us being able to say clutch, clutch, clutch if they're going awry. So we want to make sure that, we've thought about beforehand, where can we strategically be to have that, runaway motorcyclists that might need our assistance visually as opposed to audibly.
Yeah, and to add to that, Chris, I think she talked about people being visual learners. I think it then becomes important for us to think about any kind of visual cues that we can give people that will take away the words, but get the message across.
Yeah, the first class I taught with deaf students, at the end of the first day, I remember riding home and thinking that the deaf students did just as well as the hearing students. And these were in the days when if you finished the weekend and you still had a voice on Monday, you hadn't done your job well. So I thought the deaf students did just fine and they didn't hear anything I said. And so when I came back on Sunday for level 2, I told my partner, I said, I'm not going to speak today if at all possible. And I mean, it significantly changed the way I've taught since then, because then the awareness of where I'm standing and can they see my signals and adjusting, realizing so many coaching positions were completely useless. It was a very, very, very significant change that I've carried through to today.
Mark, thank you for that. That's actually a really good point. Like I said before, we tell our students, or our students tell us, hey, I'm a better car driver now because I took a BRC, and it's kind of the same. Often we teach deaf students, and we learned about some of our own idiosyncrasies that weren't as effective as we thought they were for all of our students, hearing or deaf. And
Yeah, I actually learned to communicate more effectively.
100%. Yeah, thanks
One
for
of the things that I've learned, I taught a hearing impaired class about 10 years ago when on full-size range, the interpreter at the time, if I remember correctly, stood close to me so the hearing impaired students, when they were on their bikes, could look over and see what they were being assigned to. And from what I remember, every one of those students, in fact, the whole class, if I remember correctly, passed the writing portion of their exam. And I learned a lot from that because, you know, the hearing impaired students had the intensity, if you want to call it, that they really, really wanted to learn to write correctly. And I think that helped with that interpreter there at the time. And I've learned a lot. And I would certainly do it again if I had the opportunity to teach a hearing impaired class.
I'd like to reiterate a little bit on what Mark just touched on, and Chris, and I know Lynn and Carol, everybody has hit really good on this, that what you learn by doing a deaf class, slowing down your verbal coaching and using nonverbal coaching impacted the way the student paid attention to you. I think that's a great lesson for all coaches in every class to be able to sit back. And I think those takeaways are really important. I know probably not so much in this group as in others I've been in, but that's a significant point. Whoever's talking, like I am right now, isn't the one learning, you know? So it's all good. Any other comments about tonight's topic?
Sometimes less is more when we're teaching.
Love it. Love it.
I got a question for you, Chris.
Absolutely.
Is it appropriate to speak directly to the interpreter, ask them a question, or is that considered a faux pas?
That's a great question, Mike. And Carol was shaking her head, and so she's got some input on that. If she doesn't mind, I'd love her.
Keep in mind, anything you say, they will sign.
Yeah, I've been caught by that one.
Yes, they will sign it. And it's been explained to me by the interpreters. No matter what you say, I have to sign it. No matter what anybody in this classroom says, I have to sign it.
I remember hearing that from the last class I taught several years ago. They do have to sign it.
Yeah, we're bound by a strict code of ethics, and that ADA is very clear on our part where we have to provide accessibility. So if it's lightning and thundering outside and nobody else bats an eyelash, that deaf person doesn't know that, and we're interpreting that. We're letting them know what the environment is and everything that's going on as best we can.
Also keep in mind, some of them do read lips very well. So make sure you're looking at them when you're talking. If they're reading your lips, that's great. They may not be looking at the interpreter as much as you think they need to.
And
So
be
make sure
careful
you're
what you say.
properly.
Well, and that brings up a point that hasn't come up yet really, is that we often have students that aren't completely deaf, but are maybe hard of hearing. And I try to watch for clues about that. You know, if I have students that are not very good at following directions, or if I see that they're watching other students to pick up on their lead. And even though we talk about, hey, if you have any issues that we need to know about, come talk to us, sometimes they don't want to. And, you know, so if I see those clues, I'll go up to that student and say, listen, I see that sometimes you're playing catch up here. Are you able to hear me okay? Why don't you stand right next to me when, you know, we're doing instructions so I can make sure you hear? Would it help for you to read my cards? You know, and I try to bring them in and give them options for if they're not able to hear, that they can, you know, get the information from the cards or from being closer. And I say, and if you don't hear, you need to let me know, because I don't want you to guess. I want you to know what's going on.
Absolutely. One last thing I want to add to that. You know, we need to check, and this is an actual term, we need to check our hearing bias. These poor deaf folks want to take a class, and we need to accommodate. Look, they pay taxes and have jobs and have families, and they enjoy recreational activities like, I don't know, motorcycling. And sometimes the best students I've ever had are deaf. So they very much deserve our attention as much as we can give them, and our accommodation as much as we can give them.
Awesome. Thanks again, Chris, for everything you did tonight.
Thank you.
And let's go ahead and knock out tonight's poll. Lots of words for everybody to get into, so I'll give you a couple minutes for that. The second of the questions is a little bit more difficult. Please read it closely. And if you need explanation, please ask. First question is, the two primary theories of accident causation are A, driver attention and risk management, B, interaction of factors and ladder of risk, C, driver culpability and driver overload, D, risk compensation and inattention, and E, cognitive dissonance and brain hemispheres. Must feel like you're crazy. Is everybody out there? Can you hear me? Oh, sorry about that. I had to reboot. We're at 88%. I'll give it another 15 seconds. No rush.
Don, you should have paid for the extra Wi-Fi.
I don't even want to talk about it.
Yeah, but was it worth it to pay that extra for the extra better Wi-Fi? Or could you have even gotten that extra Wi-Fi?
There is no extra Wi-Fi here.
Okay, that answers the question there.
Yeah.
Don, where you staying? At Motel 1?
La Quinta. Long story not to be shared tonight. It's my wife laughs.
Happy hour.
I'm going to go ahead and end polling.
Is it going to be a happy hour story?
If you would like, if we can find a Wi-Fi by then. Okay. Can everybody see the poll results? Quick stuff tonight, because I kind of swapped up from brain-based learning and went into some driver stuff. Most of this can be found in Driving, I think is the name of the book. And for the first question, the two primary theories of accident causation are actually C, driver culpability and driver overload. So let me try to get a copy of that. Doesn't matter. I lost everything tonight. So on number 2, the answer is C as well. Design of car versus freedom from authority. And I know that was kind of a difficult question. I did not write it, and I'll go back to the author and ask them what they were thinking.
I screenshot it for you, Don. I'll just send it to you.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate it because I completely lost my PowerPoint. I did a memory overload. All right. Any questions from Chris's presentation tonight or anything we've covered? Awesome. Nicole, would you like to show what we're doing next Sunday night?
Yes. So a lot of people tonight were alluding to different awarenesses, which is perfect timing because next week we're going to talk about how mindfulness matters as a rider coach. We're going to look at what mindfulness is, how it works, why it's important to us as coaches, and also how we can develop it. So a few things you can do to prepare for next week. Number 1 is take a moment a couple of times this week to think about the word mindfulness and see what comes up for you. Maybe something that you'll be ready to share next week. The other thing is we're going to do an exercise where it would be helpful for you to have a small snack with you. 1 bite of something is plenty. It could just be something as simple as a pizza. And I'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Nicole. I really appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to it. The one question I have for everybody is, would it be easier to meet at 8 next week?
I missed that. What was the question?
Can you meet at 8 p.m. Eastern time? Is there any difficulties? Because I think we may get more people able to participate. Generally, good thumbs there. And I apologize for the change, but you know, so I'll send out some emails this week and post it on the website and let everybody know. That's what we're going to. And I'll send out a reminder as well, depending on where I'm located at that point in time. Thank you again. Yes, ma'am.
What about Wednesday? Will that still be at 7 Eastern?
For this week, yes.
Okay.
because that tends to go on, and we go to 8 or 9 anyway. So yeah, I don't mind starting early because there's no particular topic. I really liked Chris's presentation tonight, and I'm looking forward to Nicole's next week, because the reason why we started Tribe Talks was to enhance the communication. And it just seems like every topic that we hit upon hits enhancing our communication, both as rider coaches to our students and then coaches to coaches. So I think we're on the right track here for a while. I am looking for people to present in the future. If you have an interesting topic that you would like to share, please contact me. Getting a little bit thin on future presenters, and you guys don't want me talking all hour. So please, please, please contact me. Otherwise, have a great and wonderful evening, and we'll see you Wednesday night for happy hour. Take
All
care.
right, everybody. Good night from here. I will not be able to make it Wednesday night. I'm teaching an evening class, but everybody have a good time and ride safe.